first of all, I have to say that I think probably the best part of my paper is the title, and I didn't actually make that up. That comes from our head of school's English, the coordinator for English, Michelle Harrison, came up with this title, and I kind of tried to write a paper to live up to the title, Keep Your Back to the Future, because I like the title so much. Eventually, in the paper, I will get to Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, where the title is drawn from, but instead I'm going to begin with another Frankfurt School thinker instead, to use as a kind of epigraph to the paper, and that hopefully everyone has a copy of the handout. The quotes that I'm talking about are on the handout. This comes from Ernst Bloch and his article, Non-Synchronism and the Obligation to Its Dialectics. And he writes, "Not all people exist in the same now. They do so only externally, by virtue of the fact that they may all be seen today. But that does not mean they are living in the same time with others. For the most part, youth turns away from the day that it has, but their dreams do not come only from an empty stomach. They are nourished just as materially by an empty condition of being young, which is not of the present." So what I'm going to do in this paper is try to parse out some of the ways in which I think being young is not of the present, and how that idea might have evolved at certain points with certain examples over the course of the 20th century. So this paper distills some of the concerns of my current book project on adolescence and temporality. Because my project is likely to seem a little crazy to non-humanities people, and probably to my colleagues in English as well, I've decided to go all out and give you the kind of craziest, least historicized version of it, in which I jump across the 20th century with abandon, trying to make thematic connections via the ways that adolescents have been figured in literature, film, psychoanalytic and medical discourse, and even briefly and tenuously Frankfurt School theory. I'm thinking broadly about the question of what kind of figure the adolescent is and has become for modern and contemporary history. What kinds of narratives, ways of understanding history, versions of temporality does thinking through the adolescent make possible at different points in time? So in the book I'm writing, called Out of Time, Adolescence and Anachronism, I analyze British and American representations of adolescence starting from the 1890s through to the contemporary or almost contemporary moment by focusing on adolescence as a peculiarly modern intervention into how we conceptualize temporality and lifespan. Of course, in one sense, adolescence has a very long history. Long before the birth of the Western teenager in the 1940s and 50s, adolescence was imagined as a period of life that generated resistance and the kind of Oedipal crisis, often portrayed as a brief, violent disruption before the reinstatement of an adult trajectory and adult values. And when I say adult values, those might be defined as economic productivity, heteronormative reproduction, the imperative to grow up and reproduce yourself, and the economic and political world, the historical and social circumstances which you have inherited, so that when I'm thinking about what adult values might be. In my book, I argue that the adolescent, and I'm using the word adolescent, I think by the middle of the century, you have the teenager, who's kind of the offspring of the adolescent. That the adolescent and the teenager have come to embody resistance to this generational progressive model. That across the 20th century, we find a series of Anglo-American portrayals of adolescence as chronological refusal and narrative rupture, of the adolescent as out of time in all the varied meanings of that phrase, as anachronistic, or ahead of his or her time, a kind of prophet of times to come, or as running out of time, perhaps already nostalgic for the childhood he or she is simultaneously eager to leave behind. Out of time can also imply reaching an end to time, whether that end is apocalyptic or individual. We're out of time, it's done. Along with modernist literature, such as that of Henry James, Virginia Woolf, and Willa Cather, I've also been looking at medical and psychoanalytic writings from the 1890s and early 1900s to formulate an understanding of the moment of the emergence of adolescence as what I like to think of as a specifically modern way of parsing time. And by that, I mean that adolescence as a conceptual category is bound up with many social shifts going on at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, changes to the education laws, which kept children in school for longer, the decline of apprenticeship, all sorts of things which opens up the space for a kind of modern version of adolescence to happen. I'm interested in the way the idea of adolescence travels in the course of the 20th century from a potentially troubling and anarchic stage we all pass through to an identity category which I think our culture now insists to a large part that we linger in indefinitely. The story of the rise of the Anglo-American teenager has been told many times from many different angles, and what I would like to do here is to focus on the ways in which 20th century adolescents often identify themselves with a different historical era to escape from their own time, imagining futures or pasts in which their unruly adolescent identities would make more sense, where the awkwardness of the adolescent's sense of herself or others' sense of her might line up differently, perhaps better. So that's a sort of preamble, and now I'm going to get into the jumping from one very brief moments in time in the history of adolescence, we might say. So I'm going to begin here very briefly with the psychologist G. Stanley Hall's 1904 two-volume tome, Adolescence, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. Hall's huge and indeed unruly work traces out a contradictory sort of anthropological cataloging of the adolescent. Hall is quick to see adolescence as criminal and wayward, in need of various forms of disciplining and reform, boys on street corners, girls becoming sexually active too early, and he pictures the adolescent body itself as awkward and gawky, even at a cellular level. I mean, Hall is, adolescence is this enormous, unbelievable category, categorizing of the adolescent at the bodily level, and the social, and the literary, and the religious. It's kind of an amazing, kind of think of it as a sort of Moby Dick of adolescence in a way, for what it has in it. Anyway, Hall at the same time as you can see him in a kind of Foucauldian project of criminalizing, disciplining. What do we need to do to the adolescent to make sure they become, do they grow up into something that we want around? He also imagines adolescence in a very different way as well. He sees adolescence as a kind of pure potential. Harnessing his commitment to recapitulationist evolutionary theory, he argues that adolescence is the taking off point for the evolutionary future of the race. Because in adolescence, the body and mind is at a moment of maximum flexibility and plasticity. For Hall, adolescence is the location where the future might begin to happen differently. So on the one hand, Hall seeks to criminalize and discipline the individual adolescent's behavior, but on the other hand, Hall clearly also idealizes adolescence as a desired kind of permanent state for the human. This is implied by his suggestion that adolescence is the site of all potential evolutionary progress. And here's a kind of quote to give you a taste of his craziness in an interesting way. Hall writes that adolescence, quote, "and not maturity is now defined, is the only point of departure for the super-anthropoid that man is to become." So it's sort of there's a real, kind of hard line evolutionary theory that's kind of tied in here too. With this very brief description, you might see that for Hall, adolescence, seen through an evolutionary lens, relies on different contradictory versions of progressive narrative and time. That progressive narrative in which we smoothly or bumpily move towards adulthood versus what we might call the prophetic narrative, in which anything might happen, in which the adolescent is a taking off point for change, for an evolutionary or even indeed a possibly revolutionary future. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave Hall behind and look briefly at three representations of the adolescent's relationship to time at very different moments during the 20th century. So really starting 1899, 1950s, and then sort of the 1980s through to the present day, are these three moments. And I'm using these sort of texts as just examples for my thinking through this. So my three examples fall broadly into the categories of that idea of the adolescent as kind of prophetic of the modern. This is in the 1890s. The second one is we're looking at the adolescent's relation to the politics and temporality of consumerism in the 1950s, when suddenly the adolescent becomes a kind of consumer par excellence. And finally, in the 1980s and into the 2000s, I'm looking at the adolescent desire to exit or rewrite time and the past, and this is where the teen movies come in at the end. But I'm going to start with Henry James's 1899 novel, The Awkward Age. Now, the plot of The Awkward Age concerns 18-year-old Nanda Brookenham's entry into and exit from the marriage market. Nanda has been brought up amongst a sort of louche, sophisticated set of deadweight, mostly penniless aristocrats who gather at her mother's salon in the 1890s. Unlike most young girls of her class at the time, she's been allowed by her mother, the manipulative Mrs. Brookenham, to mix with the company who visit the house, which includes lascivious older men and divorced and adulterous young wives. Nanda's basic problem in the book, and the crux of the problem of the book, is that she knows too much about sex and the world. She is far too sophisticated for a well-brought-up Victorian 18-year-old girl. The Awkward Age charts a moment when morals are in the process of changing to something more modern, but in which they have not yet changed. In this society, Nanda finds herself unmarriageable. At least she's unmarriageable to the man who she would like to marry, who, despite the fact that he is in fact her mother's lover, still wants to marry a pure and innocent girl who has been properly brought up. So it's very much about the double standard in really interesting ways. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. The book deliberately plays on the double meaning of its title, The Awkward Age. Adolescence is excruciatingly awkward and painful for Nanda, but the fin de siècle is similarly an awkward liminal period of transition, a point in time in which collectivities, such as Mrs. Brooks' set, are also unsure about their class position and the possibility of their survival into the more modern world. So from the very beginning of The Awkward Age, the adolescent girl is portrayed as a kind of puzzling inconvenience to the adult world of the book. So Nanda in the book is both temporally and spatially awkward for her mother. And I say temporally, in terms of time, Nanda's age, 18, gives away Mrs. Brooks' age, which is 41, and she doesn't want anyone to know that she's old enough to have an 18-year-old daughter, and this is actually quite a crucial crux of the novel. So she wants Nanda out of the way so people aren't seeing that her daughter is actually that age. And spatially, for the same reasons, the presence of that young unmarried girl in her mother's drawing room, either she wants her out of the way so no one knows she's that old, or it sets kind of some limits on the kind of free talk on which Mrs. Brooks' set thrives. And that the word free, when I use it, I'm using it in a Jamesian sense. James uses the word free and he uses the word good all the time. Both of these words mean bad or morally suspect. Here's my little lit crit moment of close reading. There is a lot of discussion in the book about Nanda's literal location in the house. Is she upstairs or downstairs? Where do you put the adolescent girl? Is she participating in her mother's circle, receiving visitors, or is she receiving visitors, even men on their own, in her own sitting room? The novel at times feels like a Venn diagram with endless consideration of who is in and who is out of whose circle or whose drawing room. The Awkward Age also perfects a trait that begins with the Victorians and continues into the Victorian fin de siècle, a kind of self-conscious desire to characterize one's era as a member of an age. The Victorians are the first people who describe themselves as the Victorians, in a sense. People in the book here are often talking about what it means to be modern, or what it means to indulge in what they call morbid modernity, another really great phrase that the book uses. So Nanda, in 1899, seems to be both at the beginning and the end of something, the dusk of empire, kind of birth of the modern. Nanda's mother, Mrs. Brooke, is the book's most consistent theorizer of modernity, and she also makes the strongest claim for the urgent need to talk about the social placement of the adolescent girl as a problem. And Mrs. Brooke says, and the quote's on your sheet, but she says, the whole question, don't you know, of bringing girls forward or not, the question of, well, what do you call it, their exposure, it's the question, it appears, the question of the future. It's awfully interesting. Now, in one fairly obvious sense, the problem of how to bring up and bring out the adolescent girl is indeed the question of the future, in that if girls are not brought forward, there may be no future for the classes with which James is concerned. If upper-class adolescent girls are prematurely exposed to sexual knowledge and hence made unmarriageable, as we see happening to Nanda, then a reproductive future for them within the bonds of conventional marriage is not possible. If this problem were widespread, rather than confined to a few unlucky girls whose mother, like Mrs. Brooke, allow their daughters too much freedom, then something would have to give. Social conventions and expectations for adolescent girls would have to change, or the class could not reproduce itself. So there'd be no kind of future for the English upper classes. One way the awkward age has been read is through contemporary fin de siècle anxieties about degeneration, about the new woman, the new feminist woman, and the decline of empire and how one might go about securing a future for the English upper classes. And the developing social sciences of the late 19th century were deeply concerned with all of these thorny questions. But within the book itself, Nanda also does a kind of anthropology of herself. With a disturbing self-knowledge, she recognizes herself as spoiled, in a sense, for the marriage market. She sees herself as damaged goods, as she almost, I think, amazingly describes herself at one point. But my situation, my exposure, all the results of them that I show, doesn't one become a sort of little drain pipe with everything flowing through? I had to kind of include that quote in there. It links so well to Freud's contemporary work with hysterics and his fascination with young women's knowledge of sexuality, of how much they know, of how, and Nanda sort of picturing herself as a drain pipe with too much knowledge of the world flowing through. Found really fascinating. So, however, and I'll get to the end of my awkward age section here, the awkward age also suggests that Nanda is much more than just an evolutionary dead end. On the one hand, she ends the book by going off with a much older man, a kind of substitute father, a grandfather figure, and it's clear she will not have that reproductive future. But on the other hand, she's also spoken about and speaks about herself as a kind of portent of the future, a kind of prophet figure. She speaks about herself as a type that is already in the ascendant. Right towards the end of the book, she says of herself, talking about girls like her, "We're many of us, we're most of us, as you long ago saw and showed you felt, extraordinary now. We can't help it. It really isn't our fault. There's so much else that's extraordinary that if we're in it all so much, we must naturally be." And she's talking about in it, knowing so much about the world. To me, Nanda here sounds as if she stepped out of one of those 1950s John Wyndham science fiction novels in which a town starts serving up mutant versions of adolescents who say, we're most of us extraordinary. She's a sign from the future, whether a harbinger of the dying out of one version of the upper classes or of the adaptations to modernity and modern modes of sociality and sexuality which are necessary for it to continue. The awkward age shows a society in transition. Its adolescent heroine is sacrificed in a sense because she is ahead of her time, too modern for her moment, and aware of her predicament. Now, I'm going to move along, jump ahead in time now. That was sort of my example of prophetic time, or the adolescent as prophecy, in a sense. I'm going to jump ahead to 1950s Britain now, to a moment when the adolescent has been thoroughly modernized and sexualized, out on the street with money to spend, turned into a creature who might be unrecognizable to Nanda. And I'm going to be looking at Colin McInnes's 1959 novel, Absolute Beginners. Maybe some of you know it, or the very terrible Julian Temple movie from 1986. I'm not sure if people don't go out and see it, but Colin McInnes's novels and essays have often been read as works of participant observation, anthropology. He immersed himself in the underworlds of 1950s London, fascinated by the lives and styles of immigrants, adolescents, lesbians and gays, jazz and pop musicians, pimps and prostitutes. Absolute Beginners is the middle novel of McInnes's trilogy of London novels, which also includes City of Spades from 1957 and Mr. Love and Justice from 1960. Each of these novels celebrates London and broaches the possibility of kind of understanding between blacks and whites, while also acknowledging that some racial barriers may be permanent. McInnes is at his most utopian in Absolute Beginners, in which teenagers appear at times as potentially redemptive figures for the city. But this representation is full of contradictions, which I'm going to just talk a little about. So the nameless narrator of Absolute Beginners is an 18-year-old London dweller, enthusiastic Vespa rider, and amateur photographer. The novel takes him on a picaresque journey that moves from Soho to Ladbroke Grove to Pimlico, from coffee house to jazz club to swank party. Absolute Beginners reflects the ease and economic confidence, or at least this image of ease and economic confidence with which teenagers, newly armed with disposable incomes, move through the city in the late 1950s. and an influential study of market research from 1959 by Mark Abrams, which is called The Teenage Consumer, looked at what's called distinctive teenage spending for distinctive teenage ends in a distinctive teenage world. So this sort of idea that the teenager is very much tied in to that moment where they suddenly have money, which is reflected directly in the book too. The narrator begins the book claiming that he is apolitical, interested in only what he calls the teenage ball. And eventually he gets caught up in the political happenings of his time. Then in the September of 1958, race riots broke out in London in the neighborhoods around Notting Hill, provoking new debates about immigration and also some media-led outrage towards teenagers, especially the Teddy Boys, who are arguably Britain's first youth subculture, who are held responsible for the violence. The novel culminates with the narrator watching the riots with growing horror. He attempts to help out where he can. He sort of ditches his camera and gets involved in he ditches his kind of non-participant stance and gets involved in helping people out. McInnes claimed that Absolute Beginners was supposed to be his book about teenagers, while City of Spades was supposed to be his book about race, but events overtook him, and the Notting Hill race riots made race central to Absolute Beginners as well. Now, just to talk a little bit about how adolescence is portrayed in the book. As it often is, it's portrayed as a threshold to the adult world, but a threshold that is in fact more satisfying, more vibrant, more alive than what comes after it. Adults are looked on with scorn by the narrator and his friends. They're referred to as taxpayers and conscripts. This is, of course, is an inherently tragic position. If you are young, you are always about to exit paradise. The promise of adolescence can be seen as something that dies as it's born, that kind of contains its own death drive. And if you think about the title, Absolute Beginners, suggests that the teenager is at the start of something big. But what is given birth to in the book is a kind of an identity category that transcends actual age. However, the book also is very aware that every individual adolescent is always on the verge of being lost to adulthood. The narrator of Absolute Beginners at 18 knows, as he puts it, that he will very soon be out there among the oldies. So I'll just talk a tiny bit about the novel's first sentence, which is a really interesting opening sentence because it predicts an end rather than a beginning. And it goes, "It was with the advent of the Laurie London era that I realized the whole teenage epic was tottering to doom." Now, this is kind of mournful in advance. Laurie London was a 14-year-old manufactured pop star in the late 1950s, saying he's got the whole world in his hands. To the narrator, he's a sign of decadence, a signal that the age of the teenager has already passed or is in the process of passing. So that novel that promises a beginning in its title, in its first sentence, already suggests that it's in danger of collapsing. The beginning is collapsing. In one sense, that tottering teenage epic is the familiar death cry of any subcultural movement in which there is imagined to be a kind of phase of authenticity, usually brief, followed quickly by selling out and commercialization. And the narrator exclaims to his friend, the Wiz, "They buy us younger every year. Why, little Mr. L's voice hasn't even dropped yet. So who will those taxpayers try to kidnap next?" And see, I'm interested in the way teenagers shift from being from being consumers to being consumed. Which seems to point out the ways that the way the book imagines the power of youth at certain moments, that this power is largely illusionary. And the questions I'm interested in asking, how does the built-in obsolescence of the individual teenager, each of whom will soon be out there among the oldies, line up with a sense at the end of the 1950s that McInnes's London is entering a kind of collective age of the teenager? How might the obsolescence of the teenager collect to the obsolescence of the commodity? These are some things I'm going to say. I'm sorry I'm running over. I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about high school movies, and then apologies for, I thought it was a little shorter. So I'm going to move I'll skip a little bit and move into this next section, jumping ahead in time once again and winding up with this brief look at the teen time travel movie as another kind of a moment in this trajectory. So when I say the teen time travel movie, what do I mean? Most straightforwardly, there is the teenager as a kind of time traveler, often accidental, with the power to alter the future, past or present. The Reagan era Back to the Future from 1985 is probably the text for this, but Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure from 1989 and Donnie Darko also fit into this category. A related plotline involves the adult who actually travels back in time to his high school years, his or her high school years, to revisit the choices he or she has made and see if it's possible to do them differently. Peggy Sue Got Married, Hot Tub Time Machine from 2010 are examples of this. I think the High School Reunion movie is also a really good example of the kind of teen time travel, what I'm calling the teen time travel movie. Adults go back in time to high school to heal and improve the past and thereby change the present. Romeo and Michelle's High School Reunion, a favorite. Another version of the time travel film, which is already interestingly come up already in the earlier paper this morning, a version of the time travel film that has children or adolescents changing places with adults. Tom Hanks as the boy suddenly as a man's body in Big. And recently there have been a number of movies in which where girls go back to high school, women go back to high school, either magically, as in 13 going on 30, or in Never Been Kissed from 1999, Drew Barrymore, who looks young, goes undercover in a high school and tries to do it right. So this is a kind of identifiable subgenre of the teen time travel movie, but I would rather argue that more or less all American teen movies are about time travel because they stage this confrontation between real or imagined pasts and possible or impossible futures for young people on the cusp of adulthood, with all the choice or curtailment of choice that adulthood implies. The teenager, as I suggested in the Dynamics of Absolute Beginners, comes to embody both the ultimate consumer and the ultimate thing consumed. It's youth. That's what we want to buy again. The teenager then might be seen as that perfect subject of neoliberalism, that ideological paradigm that extends the language and logic of the marketplace into realms from which it had apparently been excluded in the past, such as family, social, love relations. Of course, as I've already been arguing in relation to Absolute Beginners, since the birth of the modern teenager with spending powers in the 40s and 50s, the teenager has been identified with consumption and leisure time. But in another sense, the teenager is also on the cusp of choosing from one of many different possible future paths. The time travel narrative works really well for this. If you don't like the future you chose, time travel lets you go back and choose a different one. What for the Greeks might have been destiny or fate, to the neoliberal time traveler might seem more like a consumer choice, like a preference for Coke or Pepsi. For instance, in Back to the Future, Michael J. Fox's 80s teenager Marty McFly goes back in time to the 1950s, fiddles with the past, and purchases a new, upgraded, more affluent 1980s kind of Reaganite success story family. So I am coming to the end here, I promise. In broad chronological terms, then, I'm suggesting that if we look at mainstream Hollywood films about middle-class or affluent white teenagers from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, I think we can trace a relationship between fluctuating economic and social conditions and a kind of progressive version of time that we expect children to follow. As I suggested earlier, going back to the Romantics and G. Stanley Hall, one accepted narrative of adolescence is a kind of rebellious interlude that temporarily disrupts a developmental plot, which culminates in maturity. However, when that progressive narrative itself begins to feel shaky, for instance, when we can no longer assume that middle-class children in America or the UK will grow up to earn more than their parents, or own their own homes, or have permanent careers, or long-term marriages or partnerships, etc., when that story starts to become shaky, then the disruptions of adolescence might appear more extreme and insignificant, resulting symptomatically in time-traveling teens who may otherwise have no future within the terms that their films set out for them. Instead, what we find in these films is a constant return to the past to rewrite the present and to create a different future. So I've put a couple of examples of things I can talk about on your sheet, but I'm going to just end with the Angel of History, and apologies again for running over. Ending with Walter Benjamin's angel allegory of the Angel of History, I want to suggest that Benjamin's allegory how it might work if we think about it in proximity to the adolescent's relation to history. So here is what Walter Benjamin writes about the angel of history. A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. Now, this is not doing any justice to Benjamin's allegory at all, but I wanted to just make this last little tie-in. Benjamin's angel does keep his back to the future, which is unknown but arriving far too rapidly. But perhaps it might be more important to consider for a moment that pile of debris he sees as he is pushed backwards. That pile of debris, as some commentators have pointed out, is recent and ancient history, but it's also us. The angel of history is looking at us. We're what the angel of history sees. The adolescent, as I have been mapping her contours out here, might just be especially acutely aware of her status as the debris of history. She is the link to and hope for the future, who feels inevitably trapped by the present and the past. With that kind of weight to carry, I think it is no wonder that, as Ernst Bloch puts it, youth turns away from the day that it has. What interests me then is the many varieties